Beccy, thank you, firstly, for coming along. And we've got to start, in a way, with the birds and the bees, but also to talk about the framework that you're now working with in terms of not just observation, but also actively enhancing the environment. So we must, I suppose, start on the bad news end of the spectrum, and let's kind of think about where it's gone wrong. And then maybe we could think about how and what you're doing to make it right, and what we can do individually as a group here as well. Thank you very much for being with us this evening and telling us about the work.
Pleasure. Thanks for having me. So do you want me to start off talking about what's wrong then, Johnny?
Well,
from our perspective?
I think absolutely where we were coming in on this was to look at the landscape. I think none of us, I think, perhaps are fully aware of what the RSPB's work is doing in the and we'd love to know more about that, because I think it's, if I'm right in understanding, its role has really changed. If we think about preservation of birds and species, and I think there's so much decline around all elements of this, but there are key elements where birds particularly that you've focused on have become real success stories, and I think that's part of the story.
Yes, no, absolutely. I mean, you say it's changed, actually, interestingly, but I would sort of almost counter that a bit, because it was started really, RSPB, by three women. It's back in 89. You missed one out, so I have to 1889. I have to bring her back in, and it was a campaigning organisation. You know, so it was their work resulted in the Plumage Act, for example, which we're celebrating the 100th anniversary of this year, which was a big piece of legislation all about trying to ban the trade in feathers that women like to wear in their hats. So you'd have whole birds of paradise kind of pinned to women's hats, and egrets and kind of, you know, grebe feathers and things. And so there was this huge campaign to try and stop that. And so from 1889 until kind of 100 years ago this year, that was a big piece of work that the early Society for the Protection of Birds was focused on. And it was women, and they used to pay men to wear sandwich boards out in the street to kind of, you know, tell the story of the poor egret and this sort of thing. So it was absolutely a campaigning organisation. And we still are that today, which is, you know, a really important sort of line of sight back to our roots, I suppose. And today I would say that our expertise and our knowledge is still absolutely versed in birds. So, you know, we have a big science team at the RSPB, and a lot of their knowledge is birds based. But having said that, you know, it's really clear, as you will have heard, those of you who've heard other speakers in this series, it's really clear now that we are in the grip of a huge climate crisis and a huge nature crisis. You know, those two things are absolutely exacerbating each other and are fundamentally linked. And so in order to deliver our cause, we absolutely have to look at that context and look at the drivers for change that we're seeing. So, you know, we lead on the production of something called the State of Nature report, which comes out every few years, pulls in data from about 70 different organisations across the UK and says, okay, what's the picture for nature? And you know, I'm sure other speakers have said this, but it is grim, you know, and I'm 53, and I feel this very personally, that over the last 50 years in particular, the trajectories around nature and our natural world have been absolutely horrendous. You know, so we know from those State of Nature figures that, you know, there's been a decline of 41% in our kind of natural species over the last 50 years. We know that about 15% of the species in the UK are at risk of extinction now. So, you know, and you can, when you look at the graphs, the angle in the last 50 years has really, really steepened. And we know that the same is true globally. So we know there are about 1 million species at risk globally, and you hear chat about the 6th great extinction and so on. So that is the urgency of the situation, and that's why we have to kind of think big in order to tackle it.
And that's what's so interesting, and is the RSPB, I think, is gearing itself up for this challenge. We all are, and this evening is about hearing about those effects, and also the challenges of what we're doing about it as well. It's so really well described, and the phraseology I wanted to sort of get us going on was Kate Raworth's description of the environment, which I love, and I borrow from her and share with you, because you framed it so beautifully in this way, that the kind of donut economics of that safe bit of our livelihoods as a species and the rest of the world, and having to live within those two.
Yes. So she talks about a bounded world. Basically, she says, look, there are bounds in terms of what the earth can supply us with. From an environmental perspective, we just can't keep taking and taking and taking. There's a limit to how much we can take from the earth in order to sustain our own economy and kind of the human species. And she would say that there's a boundary in terms of a kind of social aspects as well, beyond which people are kind of thrown into poverty or unable to kind of sustain themselves. So she would say that we have to look at how we exist within those two bounds in order to be successful. And she would say that means looking at measures beyond GDP to describe our success, for example, and to live successfully. So I'm interested in that, because there's been this big report that was commissioned by the Treasury just in the last month that's landed, called the Dasgupta Review, which you may have heard sort of bandied about. And that's a really interesting report. It's huge. It's about kind of 600 pages long, but it's well worth dipping into the summary. And that kind of really talks about how we need to realise that our economies are absolutely embedded in biodiversity, in particular in the natural world, and that we need to be able to value that and pull it into our existing ways of thinking about our economy in order to make the right decisions going forward, and to stop kind of basically destroying the hand that feeds us, as it were, in terms of our own economy. And Raworth goes beyond that and says, actually, you've got to even think beyond that and think about all sorts of different measures for our own kind of success as a species. But really interesting, and it's great to see that kind of thinking landing in places like the Treasury. I mean, that would have been unheard of, in even 5 years ago. So fantastic that they commissioned it. Now we've just got to make sure that that thinking informs some of the decision making.
I think it's so interesting, and also to see it coming through from the RSPB, which has always had a very broad remit and a brilliant remit. That the fight, if you like, in your hands is actually being taken onto a different pitch, whereas it might have been about individuals' preservation and perhaps kind of tackling important issues like sort of blood sports and the rest of it. Actually, the pitch is bigger than that, really, is what you're saying, isn't it? It's not contained to these individual kind of landscape fights. It's about the environment and what we can do to tackle that. And if you're framing it in that way, it's an interesting, that's a big development on, and I noticed the RSPB have got a large section on this, and I wondered whether we might look at some of those exact examples of how that pivot's going on within your own charity to encompass the environment.
Yeah, I mean, so if we try and describe the world that we want to see as the RSPB, it is a world that is richer in nature than it is now. And one where people live in harmony with that nature. That's what we think the world needs to be like. And I suppose our contribution to that is particularly focused on how we can ensure both systemic change to get there, so thinking about our economy, things like our agricultural systems, our forestry systems, etc., and our marine systems, but also thinking about how we ensure not only a world that is net zero, and that is the kind of great pole star goal for all of the kind of climate work that's going on at the moment. We're all trying to hit that kind of pole star goal, but we would say there's a similar pole star goal for the natural world, which is to be nature positive. So to have halted that awful decline that I described earlier on, and to actually have reversed it and have turned it round so that we're getting that kind of richer natural world back that we need from a moral perspective, but we also need from a kind of a human survival perspective. And that's very much, what frames our work. And we would define that nature positive world as being around things like abundance of species. So, you know, that kind of, that great abundance that I remember even as a kid, me, I still regard myself as relatively young, but, you know, I absolutely remember, you know, I was brought up in Dorset. I can remember I used to walk these kind of chalkland grass verges for about a mile out of the village to go and see my best friend from primary school. And I can remember clouds of blue butterflies just, you know, around my feet. And just that sense of this abundance of nature, which we really have, you know, lost. So as well as kind of thinking about very threatened species, and we do a lot of work around that as well, we also do a lot of work around habitat and habitat at scale, so that you've got that abundance going on as well. And those things are both kind of very important in terms of how we frame what a nature positive world would be like.
Yeah, it's so interesting to see say that, because if you can engage people with that way of thinking, then the value they put on the environment is a very, very different one. And then by consequence, the sort of species which are dependent on these sort of diminished environments, you know, are much, much better off. I wonder if you've got any specific examples of that at work that the RSPB is working on at the moment.
Yeah, so I mean, we work across the UK, and we also work around the world, as you said earlier on. So we work in the UK overseas territories, which are often tiny little islands, which are really vital in terms of, you know, the wildlife kind of arcs they provide for our natural world. But we also work in spots around the world where we know we're required to kind of make that difference. And we work on particular species globally as well, and flyways. So it's not just all about the UK, it's absolutely thinking beyond that as well. But in the UK itself, we have about 220 reserves, which equates to about 160,000 hectares of land that we're either directly owning or managing on behalf of other owners. And so a lot of our work is focused there as well. And so an example of the kind of work we're doing around particular species, for example, where we've just joined a new partnership actually looking at the curlew, you know, and that is a species that is really under threat. About 68,000 birds, you know, left, and you know, in the UK, and the UK, we know, is a real stronghold for that species. So about between 10% and 27% of the global population of curlew it's kind of breeding here in the UK, but it's just under such threat, and that's because of both habitat loss. So curlews like a kind of mosaicy habitat. They like some short grass to kind of nest on. They like to have a kind of some rough grass as well. And as kind of particularly because agricultural policy and practice has changed over the last 50 years, we're losing that sense of a kind of mosaicy habitat that they like. And then they're really prone to predators. So, you know, a curlew's nest on the ground, if you think about that, you know, that is incredibly vulnerable. And so, you know, predators, particularly kind of foxes, for example, are a real problem for curlews as well. So, you know, that would be where we feel it's really important to do the work, do the research required to kind of investigate those drivers of decline, and then to put in place some changes through the landscape that will mean that curlew can kind of hang on, and if necessary, create on some of our reserves the right conditions to be an arc population, so that, you know, whilst we're trying to, you know, get the rest of the landscape right for curlew, we've got that population hanging on. So that's kind of an example of, you know, really focusing on one species that we feel is at risk. And we're just in the middle of, you know, writing our strategy for the next 10 years, and we've said we really want to focus on 100 species over that period of time, and really the ones that feel at risk do some work to contribute to that. And then on a habitat scale, you know, which is where we get into, I know you've been talking to Isabella Tree, you know, relatively recently. So she's, you know, talks a lot about rewilding and the work that's going on at NEP. So, you know, similarly, you know, we would be working somewhere like, what would an example be? We have a huge project in Scotland called Cairngorms Connect, and that is basically ourselves working with other partners on an area that is about 200 square kilometres of really quite wild land in the Cairngorm. And that's all about, you know, working to restore natural systems. So things like kind of, you know, blanket bog, for example, boglands, things like watercourses, wetlands. So really working to restore those natural processes, and then, you know, let the species be what they are that benefit from that, as it were. So kind of working at both ends of the telescope is important for us.
Funny enough, both ends of it was exactly what I was thinking, because in a way, half your job is to introduce, as you are now, us to an awareness of what's going on there, if you like, both in terms of habitat loss, but also in terms of education. It's not really a big part of the education literacies here. It's schools, certainly, to learn about our flora and fauna as much as we used to, and that's a huge loss. So on the other hand, you've got sort of two ends. One's an awareness job, isn't it? And I think that's what's been remarkable, certainly about this 12 months of us all being locked down, as we've looked to nature a lot more, I think, to kind of
that's so true. That's so true. I think, I mean, I can feel it myself, actually. I live in Nottingham, and you know, I feel so lucky. I live in a place where there are street trees, and I've got a garden, and then there's one of those great kind of Victorian philanthropy parks, you know, about a mile away that I can get to as well. And I just feel like that's been such a lifeline for me personally, being able to get out and sort of be amongst some kind of green environment. And we know we run something called Big Garden Birdwatch, which happens every year, and it's this huge, what we call a citizen science project. So it's gathering data from, you know, well, we think this year probably 1 million people have taken part. So it's gathering all of that data and using it to inform what's happening to our garden birds, which are some of our most common birds. So things like, you know, robins, blackbirds, starlings, blue tits. And really, we've been doing that over about 40 years now, and it gives us that sort of snapshot of what's happening to our garden birds. And what's been amazing this year is the level of participation. You know, people were just really interested, and the same around bird song. People are suddenly, I think during the last lockdown, we were much quieter, and people really noticed bird song, you know, and so people have become really fascinated by that, I think, and it's genuinely brought solace to people, and they've really sort of woken up to the natural world on their doorstep.
Okay.
So that's definitely been a shift that we have seen, I think, which is great.
That is encouraging. So you've noticed an empirical shift in the volume of people engaging with these projects, which are obviously laudable in their own right. But that would suggest, certainly to anybody else here, that people are more actively involved with that.
Yeah, I think that in a way that's the great test for an organization like us. You know, I feel hugely responsible that we are able to take that sort of nascent interest that somebody might have in, you know, a robin because it reminds them of their granny, or, you know, something like that, and actually just kind of open the door to that kind of much bigger world that's going on in terms of what's happening to our natural world, and ways in which you can engage with that, you know, and because of the sort of scale of the issues we're facing now, I'm really clear that we need both, you know, systemic change, which you can drive through kind of government policy and influencing kind of corporate activity and so on. But we also need people as individuals, you know, to be kind of thinking about how they're living their own lives and actually kind of engaging with the nature on their doorsteps as well. And you can do that in a range of ways. But I think, again, it's both ends of the telescope. Both really, really matter if we're going to kind of turn this round.
Absolutely. And so that's really the point I'm aiming at, is that, so your sense is kind of our sense, if you like, is that people feel more actively involved in wanting to participate. And that's on a very individual basis, but collaboratively with better information, which is obviously one of the aspects of what we're driving at tonight, is to understand better. And we'll come on to what we, you know, can all do perhaps more. But who are your key partners? Because at the end of the day, we're only individuals. We're all relatively, well, we're all tiny. And but so your big kind of partners in all this, who are working with you on these projects?
So I've just had a very sleepy ladybird land on my hand.
That's a good start to start with.
So our partners are kind of numerous, really. So we work sometimes alongside other environmental organisations. I'm sure that wouldn't surprise you. So we were talking just earlier, Johnny, about we're working with 50 other environmental organisations to really push for a strengthening of this new environment bill that's coming through Parliament in England, for example. So really trying to influence that so that we have both kind of binding legal targets for turning around the natural world, and that is incredibly important. We saw just last year that the targets that the world has set itself 10 years previously in Japan at Aichi, you know, I think in the UK we worked out we delivered 3 out of 20 of them. So unless you get that binding legal milestone targets in, then governments kind of tend not to give it their full focus, or you know, kind of slightly wriggle out of it. So that feels really important, and that's where we would join up with the rest of the sector, and we would do that on the ground as well. So we'll often kind of manage contiguous areas of land, for example, and work together very closely on that. But we also have kind of perhaps more unusual partners, for example, working closely with farmers around particular areas, working with water companies. So United Utilities is a water company that we work a lot with, particularly in the north of England.
Yeah.
And working as well with kind of corporate partners who are perhaps trying to you know, achieve common goals. We've done some really good urban work, for example, which has been, you know, sponsored by a supermarket and has allowed us to get into schools and deliver a lot of that sort of learning and engagement work. And I think what's interesting, I think, is that you were talking about carbon markets, I think, when you were giving the introduction, and I think there's a sense in which that world is sort of opening up at the moment, and I think there are more and more financial institutions and corporates who are interested in how they can play a role in trying to, you know, achieve these 2 great Polestar goals, and who want to kind of join in, but are sort of feeling around a bit for what is the right way to do it, and to do it without greenwashing, which is the great risk,
which is where I'm. So this is where I'm driving at, and you're
yes.
Beccy's right there, and you're the right person absolutely to energize this, because ultimately law and economics are going to be the 2 things alongside philosophy, 3, which are going to really drive these changes, aren't they? But at the end of the day, it's the stick and the carrot, and let's say the carrot is the philosophy, and the stick is the law. So incentives for companies to engage with carbon beneficial. I mean, assuming that the projects that have been engaged with individually by the RSPB and as part of wider endeavours are carbon beneficial, carbon negative work. That's a huge part of it, but as yet there's no incentive as it stands with the utilities other than financial benefit for them to be working on these projects, is there? I mean, what's the incentive as it stands?
So I think for utilities, someone like the water companies, for example, you know, they are close to this. You know, they know that kind of, you know, water quality, for example, if they're trying to fix water quality in a reservoir, they can kind of do much better by fixing the catchment area in terms of landscape than kind of putting all the kind of technology and cost in the reservoir to kind of clean the water, for example. So they have been in touch with that kind of approach for some time, and I think in a way, you know, the water companies have joined up recently to kind of really set themselves targets around net zero and kind of, you know, nature positive, which has been good to see. I think some of the carbon market stuff is more challenging, actually, and I think it remains. It can be something of the Wild West still in terms of a market, if I'm honest with you, you know, and I think the big challenge, and funny enough, I was talking to the Secretary of State about this just this week. The big challenge, I think, is setting the right standards in those markets so that they work really well and achieve the right outcomes. I think, you know, the danger with this sort of twin crisis of climate and nature is that you can kind of pursue net zero, for example. You can say, okay, a way to net zero would be to plant lots and lots of trees everywhere. Feels like a really obvious answer. But if you do that in the wrong way, so for example, in our view, that would be if you do it in a way that actually does damage in terms of the nature crisis, then you're not getting to the right solution. So we have to find these smart solutions that work across the piece, and that's where I think really good regulation and really good standard setting can help do that.
to go back to your point about the Environment Bill going through, and also, as you say, pressurising, because it's got to come from a legal framework first. Effectively, it's government policy here that's going to.
Yeah, I think government has to step in and do this right. Yeah,
interesting blended solutions, which I think are fascinating, as you say, really exciting opportunities for farmers to invest in this, set aside land, getting commercial returns for carbon, those sort of things, which would be.
Yeah,
huge.
I mean, globally, we know that we think probably about kind of 30% of the sort of solutions we need to tackle the climate crisis could be nature-based solutions. So that is things like tree planting, but also restoration of peat bogs, thinking about our marshes, for example, and our salt marshes, and the carbon they could lock up, thinking about the soil in our farming systems, so we think there's a kind of a huge opportunity there, and certainly the kind of the talk at the moment is that when Glasgow hosts COP26, this big climate meeting towards the end of the year, that nature-based solutions can be a real focus of that. And I think there is a real kind of a sense of momentum around that at the moment, which is great to see and which we have to keep up.
Yeah, I totally agree. And also, so where do you see the government on the spectrum of this? Kind of like resistant, positive, leading? Where are you happy with the way that this government's going at the moment on it?
I kind of feel like I have a number of different angles on it, really. I think it's fantastic to hear a Prime Minister, of the UK, signing up to things like the Leaders' Pledge for Nature, which he kind of signed up to late last year, and which we've now got 85 countries signed up to, which is all about saying we want to achieve kind of protection and restoration of 30% of land and seas for nature, by 2030. And that's moving towards that kind of great kind of pole star that I talked about being nature positive. Yeah. I think that the challenge is always, how do you then deliver that domestically, which is where things like the targets in the Environment Bill come into play. Yeah. And how do you make sure that the whole government is aligned around that agenda? And that's always a challenge in kind of, a siloed government. But we would
as well.
Yes, yeah, we would point to things like the recent decision around the Cumbria coal mine, for example, the decision around kind of allowing neonics on farms, recently for kind of sugar beet. You can see things that just don't fit with that kind of direction of travel. So I think just being joined up and being really challenging around things like kind of, a true green recovery from COVID, for example, and making sure that we are investing in nature and in climate solutions as part of our recovery from COVID, which after all is a zoonotic disease. It's caused by us pushing back too hard on nature. And, we have to do a recovery that will give us resilience to further pandemics going forward. So it's just making sure we're joined up and holding feet to the fire around that, I think.
Yeah, it is. I hold that phrase as well, because feet to the fire is such an emotive phrase, sounds deeply painful. And I love it because also a lot of environmental change has been sort of activist led, and there has to be, to use the phrase joined up, you have to have more compromise, really. So, there is rightly neonic debate, and there are arguments on specific use of what it's using. And so you've got to you sense that, the ideal would be a push away from the sort of the protest led to sort of more of the kind of like, let's get the top of the hill confirmed, and then we'll figure out the road we go. And, as long as we're holding hands on the way through, it's really interesting. And I think one of those points is, it's just, there's a couple of conversations going through in the chat while we've been chatting, but I think, and there's some good, they're all very good, but the one I wanted to pick up on is on the science, actually, and how much more science is leading our inquiry, but also our kind of, sense of solutions. And I don't think we would have had that unless we'd had this terrible year. We've kind of fallen back in love with science, really. And I guess, data has been at the foundation of the RSPB's work, really, isn't it? That's probably coming to very good stead now to help us understand the changes that we are seeing, and also changes we've got to make. And I know your role is very big and across the RSPB, but I know there's a lot of people listening. We'd love to hear the stories about those birds and changes which have happened. I mean, the success stories that have been reintroduced. You touched on Gough Island, which I love the idea of, very sort of English British sort of concept of going out and working in these remote areas. Is there and is there others closer to home where we've had similar successes?
Yes, yeah. So let me think of a couple of examples here. I mean, the first thing to say really is that I think the scale of the work that the RSPB does around science and the strength of its science teams and the way in which it approaches things from an evidence base is one of the reasons I came to the organisation. I'm not a scientist myself, but I just think it's such a strength to hold that inside the organisation and have that as part of our approach. And funnily enough, I was talking to that team about a couple of months ago. They have a big annual gathering, and of course it was all online this year. But I was talking to them, and it was the day that Joe Biden was being inaugurated in the United States, and he had said that science would be at the heart of his administration. And I just thought that was such a kind of a heartening thing to hear in terms of that turnaround, really. But I mean, yeah, in terms of kind of work we've done quite a lot of species reintroductions ourselves. So we were involved with the white-tailed sea eagle, for example, in up in Mull. If any of you have been lucky enough to go to Mull and to see that bird, I mean, it is absolutely enormous. I mean, they call it the flying barn door, and it is absolutely huge. I just remember one flying right past me when I was on Mull. A really exciting bird. And you know, and that has been a tremendous success story and has kind of driven some of that sort of ecotourism in a way in Mull as well. So it's driving that economy as well. And now, of course, you've got Roy Dennis bringing those sea eagles down to the Isle of Wight. I was reading just on social media today, it flown across above someone's village, you know, in Somerset somewhere. So, you know, there is this huge success story. And the same with kind of red kites, were another bird that was reintroduced in the 80s. There'd been a tiny population left in Wales, but otherwise kind of persecuted almost to extinction. And using some Spanish birds, they were reintroduced in the 1980s really successfully, and now big populations.
Absolutely. And I mean, it's interesting. How could you not love the stories of reintroductions? They're brilliant. I mean, red kites, far be it to me say, seem to be almost, you know, too brilliantly successful. They're a problem, but it's interesting. I suppose how quickly, and this is one interesting that's come up a lot, is how quickly nature rebounds, given a chance, and that's the key. Given a chance.
It has to be given that chance.
And the other bird I was heard about was the biggest bird in England. I don't know if this is true, but the Dalmatian pelican. I've never seen it right, but apparently it was a native of this island, of these islands.
So Ben McDonald talks a lot about pelicans and bringing pelicans back to the Somerset levels, which would be amazing. And you know, and cranes actually. So cranes are our tallest bird. Absolutely gorgeous bird, and we've now got, I think, 180 cranes back in the UK from a small population in East Anglia, and then some introductions in the southwest. So you know, there are some really exciting stories going on at the moment in terms of what's achievable. But at the same time, you know, we are seeing declines elsewhere, particularly in terms of abundance. So you know, I mean, I was talking about some of our most common birds earlier on, things like, you know, starlings. Things like blackbirds, you know, have seen these real declines. Our farmland birds in particular have really declined. So it's in a way, it's easy to get sort of distracted by these fantastic, kind of very charismatic, you know, birds, but you have to kind of look at that overall picture as well.
I think that's it. I mean, I frame them within the context of kind of like, oh, that makes me more aware and interested in the species of these islands as a whole, as opposed to kind of like, oh, it's okay.
It's a good way in.
But the wetlands seem to be a bit of a key kind of fighting territory here, because, you know, you've got a lot of activity there, because it's where a lot of our kind of like where we like to live. It's also where the climate is pushing back, and so we're likely to lose to seawater invasion and erosion. So you've kind of got interesting area. I mean, that for me kind of feels very, very fragile environment.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, we did a great project actually at a place called Wallasey in Essex, where, you know, that whole area of coastal Essex used to be, you know, 400 years ago, it was full of kind of intertidal marshland basically, and was this amazing habitat. And then, you know, gradually with kind of, you know, sea level rise and then kind of drainage for agriculture, we just kind of lost most of that habitat. I think we lost about 90% of it over that kind of 400-year period. And so there was this bright spark, saw this huge opportunity when you know, all the spoil that was coming out of Crossrail in London needed to go somewhere. And so you know, amazingly, it was taken around the coast and used at Wallasey to create this fantastic big area of kind of new intertidal kind of wetlands basically, and that basically has it's created fantastic new wetland habitat for all sorts of species. I mean, it's just hooching if you ever get the chance to go there. I mean, it can be a bit of a bleak place, but it is hooching with kind of bird life. And then it's also protected some of those inland communities from flooding risk. So it's absolutely kind of played both sides of that agenda I was talking about. And, you know, fantastically, I mean, the boldness of that sort of somebody thinking that we could do that, just brilliant. And of course, that's not just us on our own, that's us working with other partners as well. But, you know, that kind of wetland and kind of coastal realignment story that we're now kind of facing into with kind of changes in kind of sea level and changes over the last 50 years in particular in agricultural practice. It's a really exciting one. You know, there's some really real benefits that can be gained from thinking about our wetlands and how we use them. And you know, it's so important.
It's really key. So this sort of diversification of monoculture agriculture into elements where it's got blended activities, and I guess, you know, these pressure points, you know, they are pressure points, aren't they? Because you get species kind of competition, you know, and you think about, well, how much, I mean, I don't know if it's a question you can answer, but, you know, how much can you get involved in that fight? I mean, you know, if you've got, you know, non-native species suddenly coming in, you know, green parakeets coming in, one question coming through, and cormorants, and or just very successful predators coming in and kind of, you know, diminishing habitat environment. It's sort of, I mean, nature's red in tooth and claw, isn't it? How much, you know, could we, can engage?
Yeah, and interestingly, parakeets is something I get asked a lot at the moment. They're very much in the news, and I think people are really noticing them, and you know, and they're thriving in some of our kind of urban areas. So London's, you know, obviously they've been around for a while. I can remember actually, I was lucky enough many years ago to stay in Ham House in Richmond, and I can remember kind of waking up to the sound of this scraping noise, and I couldn't work out what it was, and it was parakeets kind of pulling all the mortar out of the old stonework on Ham House, and I just thought, oh, this is going to get interesting for the National Trust. But you know, they are here in Nottingham as well. You know, somebody was saying to me just the other day that there's a small population now here in Nottingham. I mean, I think from our perspective, A, it's well out of the bag. I mean, they've been around for, you know, quite a long time now. B, I think we would always look at whether they are creating a problem on what we would call a conservation scale. So are they, you know, creating a big enough problem sort of, you know, across the UK for us to all kind of worry about? But C, definitely, I think on a local basis, they are proving problematic. They compete with birds that like to kind of nest in holes in trees, for example. I'm sure they're competing for food. You know, it's so I mean, and this sort of change is going on all the time, and you know, and I kind of think with climate change, there's going to be more of it in terms of kind of invasive non-natives and what we do about it. Yeah.
Exactly that, and it is a challenge, as you say, because where do you step in? And also, you know, maybe the problem is further upstream. I mean, not in this, I don't think in the instance of the parakeet, but other species, you know, the only reason they're coming inland, for argument's sake, is because their kind of natural habitat has been kind of, you know, eroded, so they've had to come seeking things. So you kind of, if you solve the problem there, they probably, you know, it goes away.
Yeah.
So there's other
I mean, the example you used earlier on, Gough Island in the South Atlantic, which is one of the UK overseas territories, I mean, that is dealing with an invasive species from the 19th century. So that is mice who came off, we think probably kind of sealing boats, you know, sealers coming ashore onto that tiny island, which is such an important breeding ground for seabirds. And the mice have evolved over that period of time to become basically carnivores, and they will eat the seabird chicks alive. They're starting to eat the adult birds alive, who have very few defensive behaviors because they've not been threatened. I mean, they kind of evolved without predators. And so we've got no choice but to go in and do what we call an island eradication project, where we eradicate the mice from the island to allow some species that are now at risk of extinction to enable them to survive, you know, and that's an invasive species example.
Yeah, and this is what's so brilliant about the 30% rule, which is, I think, fantastic. And Ollie Steed, who was one of the first talkers on this series, was part of that for the on the east coast of Africa in terms of aquatic areas where, you know, where spawning grounds, so basically sort of breeding grounds, so kind of like give the sort of like the source of these habitats kind of complete freedom, and you're likely as not that the migration is going to kind of continue, and so you kind of keep these hotspots alive effectively.
And that work on kind of flyways, migratory flyways, absolutely plays into that. So you've got to think about all those spots along that flyway where you know problems can occur for those species, and you know, thinking about things like, well, you know, I hate the fact that I have, you know, that I'm delighted when I hear a cuckoo now, but you know, in my childhood I heard cuckoos all the time, and that's a real example of a bird that's struggling, you know, through that flyway to make it back, and then making it back to kind of perhaps kind of, you know, habitat that's not as well suited to it as it was in the past. So, you know, these birds are really struggling along some of these spots. You know, you think about things like, you know, Malta and Cyprus, and kind of netting of small birds, for example, is a real problem still. Although we have made some incursions into that. But you know, that's why these hotspots are so important.
That's exactly that, those sort of holding areas where you can do real damage and also real good in terms of no, it's absolutely fascinating. And you know, we've talked a great deal about the birds. We do need to talk about, we did literally talk about the bees 3 weeks ago. But it's you have to think there, don't you, at the bottom of the pyramid, you know, to kind of go up through. I always wonder when I, you know, talking as we are now, whether your three founding ladies, what they think about the work today at the RSPB. They think, gosh, this has started about as kind of like an individual group of species, and apart from the ostrich was still, you could go with the ostrich, wasn't that the only one, because you could wear it in your hand.
You could wear ostrich feathers. Yes.
So they're out, but everything else. And now, you know,
I think it's because the birds didn't need to die, basically.
You could pluck, and you can pluck them, and as you say, but now we've got to think about, you know, the actual environment that's supporting them, and the research that's going through there. It's absolutely.
Well, I mean, I think it's what we're starting to understand, I think, is you know, that there are these really important places around the world, and domestically, where we've got a chance to kind of you know, get our carbon agenda right, in terms of, you know, sequestering the carbon we need to sequester, but also get our kind of nature recovery on track. And if, you know, if you look around the world globally, obviously there are really important forest areas, you know, which one hears a lot about in terms of, you know, what's happening in the Amazon, for example, and how we can look at how our footprint beyond these shores is driving some of that destruction, and what we can do in terms of due diligence to try and reduce that for, you know, key commodities. But you also look at places, I mean, just last year we were involved in another UK overseas territory in the South Atlantic called Tristan da Cunha, and working with the community there on the island, tiny little island, you know, tiny little community, to really basically work with a whole heap of wonderful, you know, funders who wanted to help work with us and the UK government and National Geographic and others to set up a huge marine protection area. I think it's 700,000 square kilometres, you know, of no take marine area, because
Yeah.
it's an absolute cradle of, you know, species like kind of the blue shark, all sorts of birds. You know, it's just this really important area in the South Atlantic, and if we can't protect, you know, those really fundamental areas like that around the world, now we know where they are, then, you know, all hope is lost, really. So it's just really focusing on those. And we've done a piece of work just recently in the RSPB to really map where those nature rich and carbon rich areas are, so that we can kind of focus efforts on those. And about, you know, 2/3 of those areas are not protected. They're not protected by things like our, you know, our SSSI protection, for example, or, you know, our SPAs. They're just outside that protection. So we've really got to look at how we join those areas up and look after them.
And how do you think we can get these sort of projects funded?
I think it's a really good question. So I think there are some absolute dedicated souls who, you know, support organisations like us through being members or through being donors, for which, you know, we are enormously grateful. If anyone here is an RSPB member, thank you so much. You are so important to enabling that kind of all the work I've described really to go on. But I think we've got to kind of be able to unlock more private sector investment to deliver the kind of scale of work that I'm talking about, really. So you are back into some of those kind of things like carbon markets, for example, and thinking about you know, the way in which kind of, you know, pension fund for investment, you know, for investment can be unlocked, for example. So I think that's the kind of scale we've got to look at, and really looking at how we use our public funding to help unlock some of that as well. So being smart about that and how we kind of match it all up. It's a big ask, you know, but I'm an eternal optimist, and I do have hope, having seen things like the desk up to review land, that realization is certainly starting to happen, I think. And it's just making sure that we put in place the frameworks to make that work.
It does. It's interesting. Those feel like very green, very young spring shoots, but definitely shoots coming up in the right sort of field, really, of inquiry about.
Yeah, and getting things like the new agricultural financing system right. Yeah, exactly. Well, you've got that opportunity now out of CAP. You know, we can design that, we can make it deliver public goods for public money and all that sort of thing, and getting that right feels really important as well. So that's an example of, you know, making sure that public money is unlocked in the right way.
Absolutely. And just for example, if I did suddenly say, I'm going to be Prime Minister first, and then you can be second. Well, I'll go, and you can correct all my mistakes.
Beccy be Chancellor.
Yeah, better, definitely. Because it is about money, and you're absolutely right. It's like if I said, okay, come on, right, we've got all this money now. We're going to shift policy. We're going to put serious investment into these projects. Can you quantify them for me? Like, have you got the science and the RSPB to say, I can give you a metric that's going to give you either this much of a species regeneration, this much carbon. So effectively, it's going to be a kind of quantifiable return. So you can say, here's much money, and you're going to say, I've done this X in return.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely possible. Yeah, that's absolutely possible, particularly around, it's easier around carbon at the moment. It's probably more difficult to quantify around kind of biodiversity gain. But even there, you can see ideas like, you know, biodiversity net gain is an idea that's knocking around in terms of kind of developers, for example. So we're starting to get to some of that, and you know, and things like the desk up to review again have helped us move towards some of that. So I don't feel it's far off. And I think, you know, what you have to ask as well is, you know, what is the risk? What is the cost of not doing some of this as well, in terms of, you know, implications for our future?
Oh, I think we are 100% bought into that. I think most people here on this call today say that, you know, this is about the now, and it's the now because we care about tomorrow, and
yes, it's
totally natural. You know, you can
and it's intrinsic value, you know, just the joy of being out in nature, you know, it's just, you know, it's marvelous, you know. I absolutely buy into the kind of whole moral argument of, you know, doing our thing to make sure that the natural world survives, not only now but for our kids as well.
I do too. I just have a realistic approach that no one, unless there's a financial benefit to them. But financial benefit can mean other things, as you say, and those GDP figures, if that was actually to do with net natural gain as opposed to net financial gain, might be as valid. It's really interesting, Beccy, hearing you talk about these things. I think the RSPB is just kind of pivoting in your hands into a really exciting, big picture territory that's going to have a huge influence on the outcome.
I'd love to take credit for it all, Johnny, but I think it's been pivoting for a while.
Well, it's in your hands now, and I'm going to echo one of the comments on this conversation, saying it's really inspiring hearing you talk about it, because it is. And thank you very much for being part of this tonight. And actually, I haven't asked you. I'm sorry. I took Prime Minister role, and I didn't ask you what you would do. So you've been upgraded. Not only you, the RSPB, you're now on the wheel of the government. What are we going to do?
Am I Chancellor or am I Prime Minister?
I think you definitely are going for Chancellor here, aren't you? I can see that. Yeah, brilliant. Yeah, you got your powers first.
I mean, the overriding thing from the Chancellor perspective is we're not currently investing nearly enough. So we're in terms of biodiversity, we currently invest, I think it's about 0.03%, of our total spend, and we've done the calculations. Actually, we know how much needs to be spent to get us on that trajectory of halting decline and turning it round.
What's that number?
And it is it's about 1.7 billion, we think, a year, that needs to be spent. And I think that is entirely doable through some of the routes that we've talked about, in this conversation. So it's absolutely doable. But we need the Chancellor, me, if I'm Chancellor, I need to be taking that seriously and taking that kind of longer term view of the kind of investment that's going to deliver not only for now, but for the future as well. And I think there are smart ways in which to do that. I think if we were to have a genuine green recovery from COVID, for example, I think that could really help deliver some of that spend. So I think it's about not putting things in boxes, and it's about thinking across the piece.
That's brilliant. And so just to ask a question, so 1.7 billion, so I have no idea of the numbers. What percentile is that? So you're looking for, because if it points
I think it's about it would need to go up to about 3%, I think. Yeah.
Okay, so it's quite substantial. I rather agree with you. I'm rather taken by the idea of green revolution, because the best economics I find is when you can generate it yourself. I mean, it's so much easier. Well, it's very easy to spend money. I think it's easier, better if it's generated, if it kind of, the concept itself becomes the motivation. And so I think your green recovery is definitely I'll be voting for that for sure.
It's such an opportunity, to get this right. Yeah,
it really is, isn't it? And I think so, and it definitely seems to come back again to this: can you get these unit values attached to these brilliant projects? And as you say, you're selling the concept. We're here for that. Now, how would we get the investment transferred across into it from? It's really, really telling.
I'm looking at the chat, and the first one is somebody saying they thought I was going to be talking about the impact of climate change on birds migrating, which we barely touched on.
I know. I think we did, didn't we? I was onto that. I was like, well, no, we're definitely here because we've got wetlands and we're in, are we? Do you want to? Well, let's go. Take us there. What have we not covered on that element?
Wait, I mean, just that when you look at the sort of you remember I talked about that report called the State of Nature report that we produced with all this data from 50 organisations, and when you look at the drivers of decline, then absolutely climate change, it's not only kind of intrinsically linked through things like nature-based solutions, but it's absolutely a driver of that decline as well. So of course it's having an impact on birds migrating. Think about kind of dry areas of just expanding in terms of kind of birds having to cross deserts, etc., all of that is going on, you know, and that's causing changes to habitat as well. But I mean, when you look at the UK in particular, you've also got the big drivers of things like kind of, you know, agriculture policy and practice, because that covers 70% of our land. You know, 70% of our land is under some kind of agricultural system, and there are amazing farmers farming in ways that absolutely balance those different stewardship needs of land. But there are also you know, huge pressures around intensification and kind of, you know, a more monoculture approach that have really caused some damage to the natural world. So you know, there are lots of drivers, but climate change is definitely up there, and particularly on migration.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're absolutely, I mean, it's a self-evident case. You know, climate change is affecting migration, no question at all. All we can do is, as you say, is mitigate the landscape we've got around us to the best of our abilities. And someone else here is saying that, you know, the agricultural policy is the one that is going to drive those changes, because better land management is going to lead to that. And I think that covers through very well. And we touched on the idea of keeping those breeding grounds sacrosanct as well, and the flight corridors through, which I think definitely stack up as well. Guys, I don't think we've had a talk where more people have said thank you and what an inspiring conversation.
I'm sure you say that to all your guests, Johnny.
No, you know, you're absolutely, I do my best to charm, but no, this is a factual truth that goes with it as well, to say that is the case. And thank you very much. Thank you everyone for coming and getting involved.